This is part 5 of Dawson, a series on the evolution of a fictional New England mill city utilizing real history. Last episode we talked about the mass industrialization of the valley, expansion of Dawson and White, and the first trickle of French-Canadian immigrants. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend doing so. If you already have or just like to listen out of order, then welcome to the show. This is Dawson. I have a confession. I'm biased toward Franco-American history compared to other cultural histories. That's because I'm studying Franco-American studies. Why? Well, because I am. After all, you can see that in my last name, Pelletier. And in fact, that's the whole reason I'm doing this show, because it stems from my interest in Franco-American culture, which is something that has been lost in my family and my generation, and my other interest in urban planning, an interest in the urban fabric of our cities. SimCity 4 on CD was the first ever game I had, and I bought City Skylines as soon as it came out because of the disappointment I had with what EA did to the last SimCity. My interest in urban history and the revitalization of my hometown, Lewiston, fused together. I've been carrying that interest with me for years without an outlet. That's why I'm doing this series, actually. It's an outlet on my interest in urban history as someone in Franco-American studies. In my view, I don't believe that we give enough credit to these mill cities of New England. I remember watching an interview Conan O'Brien did on Late Night with Stephen Colbert. He mentioned his family was from Worcester, Massachusetts, another New England mill city. Someone in the audience cheered and he said, "No one woos Worcester." Well, why not? I think we have something to celebrate in these cities. The history, for good or bad, is still a part of us. The generations and generations of immigrants of whom we should celebrate both old and new. This series is me celebrating just that. It's celebrating the history of these places that no one wants to talk about or even mention because they don't understand the romance and the history and importance of these places that I feel. Those things that I've come to admire about these places. My studying of Franco-American culture has come to give me a bias in where the story is accented. And that's here, beginning in the 1860s. Before, we saw only a trickle of French-Canadian immigrants start to arrive in Dawson, but not in numbers like we're going to see in this episode from 1861 to 1880. In 1861, we have a population of around 6,000 people in Dawson, a growth of 2,000 people in a single decade. The next 2 decades show growth as well, with an end population of 35,000 in 1880. A good portion of these numbers come from French-Canadian immigrants. With such a large influx of this linguistic and culturally distinct population, we start to see some change in the local culture of Dawson. Something that is important to these French-Canadian immigrants is what they call la survivance, which is the survival of the French-Canadian culture throughout the future generations. Professor Claude Bélanger describes the 3 pillars of la survivance, quote, "The first pillar was that of faith. What distinguished the faith of the Canadians, a term he is using for French Canadians, from the others on the continent is that they were Roman Catholics, whereas the others were Protestants. In the 18th and 19th centuries, religion was a prime element in defining the people and an essential cultural value in their life. Several people's sense of belonging, of defining themselves, hinged virtually solely on religion. This was the case among the Irish, and it was also to be so in Canada among the French. Language was a second pillar of survival. The language of the Canadians was French. They sought to preserve it, especially as attacks on their language eventually multiplied, or as their language was increasingly discounted politically, socially, and economically. Yet, for a long time, it was evident that maintenance of the language is not as essential to the survival of the people as maintenance of the faith was. In fact, if the French language was to be maintained, and nobody seriously questioned that, it was frequently because the language, by insulating the people from the rest of the continent, would serve to preserve that faith. The French were Catholic, and as long as they remained French, they would remain Catholic. English was a language of Protestantism. To absorb English, worse to abandon French to replace it by English, was seen as the first step in abandoning the faith. Thus, the importance of the French language was that la langue est sa gardienne de la foi. Language is the guardian of the faith. No contradiction was ever seen between the two, and none, in fact, existed. The third pillar to ensure the survival of the people and to serve to distinguish them from others was that of the institutions. A variety of institutions characterized the Canadians throughout their history." End quote. At this time and place in Dawson, the institutions were things like recreational organizations, like the Snowshoeing Club in Lewiston, Le Club Montagnard; economic, such as the Caisse Populaire, or fraternal organizations, such as the Institut Jacques Cartier, another Lewiston organization. Some of these we don't see in Dawson just yet, but we do see the establishment of a fraternal organization, Ligue Champlain, or the Champlain League, in 1867. All of these things really cemented the idea of laissez-vivance to an actual practice, but it is named survival, which implies that there is a force against it. This was international for French Canadians as it was and still is in Canada, and was so for French Canadian immigrants in mill cities. From the get-go, the Irish in Dawson felt that the French Canadians came to these mill cities to take their jobs. As soon as the French Canadian immigrants stepped off the train, the Irish Catholics and the Anglo-Protestants would hurl slurs at the French Canadians, calling them things such as frogs or Canucks. French Canadians would be subject to daily discrimination from the Irish and long-term systematic discrimination from the Yankees. Daily discrimination from the Irish started as petty things such as dumping dirt in the French Canadians' water buckets for drinking, but eventually became more violent, such as the Irish throwing stones at French Canadians. Tensions between the immigrant groups would get pretty heated, as it was reported that there were some fights between the Irish and French Canadians which had death tolls. Here's an excerpt from an article by the New England Historical Society called "How the French-Canadian Textile Worker Came to New England." Quote, "One night in 1880, a 23-year-old band member named Jean Blanchette was talking in French with several bandmates near Victory Park in downtown Manchester. 3 intoxicated Irishmen came out of a beer parlor and heard the French spoken. They attacked the French-Canadian textile workers, who fought back. One of the Irishmen fell on a bottle of hard liquor in his pocket, and it broke. He threw the broken bottle at Jean Blanchette, severing his jugular vein. Blanchette died 20 minutes later. 1,000 people marched in his funeral procession through the streets of Manchester, which were lined with French onlookers. 60 years later, Philippe Lemay said the French-Canadian textile workers didn't exact revenge from the Irish who killed their friend. Blanchette's assailant went to prison for 5 years and died shortly after his release." End quote. The clashes between the Irish and French communities stemmed from the fact that they shared the Catholic religion but did not share a common language. Alongside the factor that the French Canadians would work for cheaper wages, the French Canadians wanted French priests and bishops in the parish, while the Irish didn't. The discrimination from Anglo-Protestants, or Yankees, however, was more than just a fight outside a bar, and instead more systematic and long-lasting. The discrimination was not only on the French, but on the Irish as well. Yankee mill supervisors and executives would keep either French or Irish from becoming anything more than laborers because of their Catholic religion and economic standing as immigrants, as it was felt by the mill executives and supervisors that the Irish and French would always remain in the laboring class. This discrimination for the Irish and French lasted until the end of the 19th century, and even after, Yankee supervisors would scoff at the idea of the French becoming supervisors or administrators. Some French Canadians who were so willing went to the length of anglicizing their surname in order to give them a greater chance of rising in the mill ranks. A couple examples being LeBlanc to White or Pinette to Spruce, with far more examples than this. For many French Canadians, their intentions were to work in the United States for a short period and then go back to Quebec and bring their savings with them. Some did this, but far more others stayed. As we've seen, there were certainly anti-French sentiments that were threatening laissez-vivance. As a result, French Canadians started to establish culturally isolated neighborhoods called Petits Canadas, or Little Canadas. The early buildings of these Little Canadas were wooden tenements built by the French Canadians. These tenements were usually about 4 floors high in the shape of a cube, with little to no space between the sidewalks and other tenement buildings. The only surviving example I could find is on River Street in Lewiston, Maine, as it seems the rest were destroyed, and understandably, the living conditions in these tenements were horrible, with overcrowding due to the lack of housing in the area at the time of their construction and absence of utilities like water, sewage, electricity, and heating. It didn't take long for investors to take note of what was going on and see the potentially lucrative market in property development, leading to the development of the triple-decker. An article in Boston Magazine by Madeline Billis called Anatomy of a Three-Decker, she describes the success of the triple-decker. Quote, "The ubiquitous dwelling known as the three-decker or a triple-decker, depending on who you ask, sprang up during the 19th century and never left. Their familiar economical model is part of the reason why. Often, the building's owner occupies one floor while renting the other 2 units to family members or other tenants. It makes sense that these 3-family structures would multiply in the years to come, as working-class populations swelled and neighborhoods like Dorchester morphed into streetcar suburbs. But three-deckers are found all over New England, creating cohesive-looking streets and close-knit communities around the region. The history of the structure is rich because their economical value has stood the test of time. In a historic New England lecture about New England's iconic multifamily housing, Senior Preservation Services Manager Sally Zimmerman explains that an estimated 15,000 three-deckers were constructed in Boston between 1880 and 1930. Dorchester's three-decker boom made up a third of that construction. Billis continues with the defining characteristics of the triple-deckers. When it comes to the design of three-deckers, it doesn't get more distinctive. They've been called the layer cake of homes. While not all of them look exactly alike, their unique construction offers up a few recognizable characteristics that apply to most, but not all, three-deckers. First, windows are carefully placed. Three-deckers feature multiple street-facing front bays, and most buildings boast windows on all 4 sides to let natural light in from every angle. As the Dorchester Reporter notes, when three-deckers are lined up next to each other, so are the side windows, allowing for residents to have awkwardly direct sightlines into adjacent units. Oh, hello, neighbor. Second, columns are a defining quality. Columns are also minimally decorated and support the building's characteristic porches. Front porch pillars can extend beyond the first floor, framing second and third level porches. The columns are part of the several strong vertical lines as seen on the three-decker's facade that chop up living spaces into sections. They cross with horizontal lines at each level, separating each of the 3 units. Third, if it weren't for the flat roofs, they might look like abnormally tall houses. While three-deckers already resemble 3 tiny stacked houses, their flat roofs make them characteristically urban. As architecture, they are curious forms, part urban and part suburban, writes author Krim in the Three Deckers of Dorchester. They look like apartments transformed into houses, or perhaps houses overgrown into apartments. They have the flat roofs of the city, but the wooden walls of the country. They appear as row houses transplanted into the suburbs. Fourth, three-deckers are always constructed of wood. While other cities were building row houses made of stone and brick, Boston, Worcester, Fall River, and other New England towns stuck with the relatively inexpensive material early settlers had sworn by. A 1977 Boston Redevelopment Authority report cites that the first wooden three-deckers sprang up in South Boston and Roxbury, where wood wasn't prohibited by city fire laws. Wood proved to be practical and easy to build when waves of immigrants came to New England after the Civil War. Fifth, a single front door leads into the building. The street entrance is almost always situated on a front porch. It provides access to a first-floor unit as well as to a stairway leading to the upper two. There are, of course, rear doors opening to a three-decker's hallmark back porches, which are not often visible from the street." End quote. As a functional building, these triple-deckers were well thought out, though dense. They had a satisfactory amount of space between them for light and airflow on all sides of the building, and a big change from the tenements with access to water, electricity, and heating. Architecturally, triple-deckers are pretty plain, but often they might have some decent exterior trim along the street. Triple-deckers were popular among both the working and middle classes, and grew exponentially around New England in places like our mill cities, such as Lewiston, Manchester, and Lowell, and especially Boston, where they were so popular, with places being neighborhoods like Jamaica Plains, Dorchester, as Madeline Billis wrote. Understandably, triple-deckers became a New England icon for working-class housing, and remain an icon today. These triple-deckers were sold as whole buildings, where they could either be split into units and the owner could rent the units out, or use the entire building for a single family spanning multiple generations. The French-Canadian families were very large, with the amount of children for a family most commonly in the double digits. An 1875 article from the Brunswick Telegraph of Maine told of a family with 24 children, though this was above average. Why were these families so big, though? There are a few reasons. The first and most commonly restated reason being the need for so many children for farm work or chopping down trees to clear land in the early days, before the families emigrated to the mill cities. Another reason would be what the French Canadians called La Revanche des Berceaux, or the Revenge of the Cradles in English. The Revenge of the Cradles was the French Canadian way to take Canada back from the English by quite literally out-reproducing them. These are all hotly debated among historians and scholars. Something to consider is that they also had a pretty high child mortality rate compared to what we're so fortunate to have today. Keep in mind that these working-class French Canadians did not have access to quality health services back then, and that deaths as a result of labor, childbearing, or daily life was quite high. So to make sure they had children to outlive them, French Canadians would most commonly have between 10 and 15 children. But the most agreed upon reason after emigrating to the United States would be that the Catholic Church wanted Catholic families to have as many children as they could. Another effect from the rise in French Catholics in Dawson is the rise in attendance of Catholic Mass in St. Patrick's Church and Prince of Peace Church, a rushed wooden structure to try and fulfill the congregation's size, which are now both reaching total capacity. At the same time, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Portland, which is part of the Archdiocese of Boston, splits in two due to the rising in Roman Catholics projected to be beyond what the single Diocese of Portland would be able to handle. Pope Pius IX establishes the Diocese of Boston in 1874, but no cathedral would be able to be planned for some time. As the population increases and the working and middle classes get quality housing, permanent commercial structures form, creating downtown. Before the 20th century, zoning didn't really exist, and instead, figuring out where to put your business had theoretically limitless possibilities, depending on what was available and where you may get the most customers. So downtowns were placed in areas with the most traffic. Places that needed to be dense would have wall-to-wall buildings to maximize land use efficiency. For example, traditional commercial blocks. As for the desire of residential areas, the quality of the surrounding environment were considered. Think air and noise pollution and location to amenities, like academies, other businesses, and transportation. Density and housing quality was often a teeter-totter. The less dense your residential building was, the more airflow and light would be let into your building, as well as spacious living arrangements and general quality would go up. On the flip side of this, the more dense your residential building was, the less quality there would be, but your square footage per person would be maximized and your land usage efficiency as well. So from a business perspective, balancing profits with quality of living arrangements was always a completely arbitrary choice that the land developer had to make depending on who was expected to live there. As population increased, the need for a transit system grew as well, and in 1871, the first horse car began to run in Dawson. Horse cars are just like rail trolleys that we see in the not-so-distant future, except their motive power comes solely from horses. Now, just for a few cents, it's possible to get from one side of the town to the other, and even over to White. This opened up development outside of places previously possible, and made living further from places of work possible as well. During the years from 1861 and 1865, the American Civil War broke out, which affected many textile mills as the supply of cotton from the plantations in the South became extremely difficult. Around this time, many textile mills became a victim to a shortage of cotton, where others were able to see the writing on the wall and stockpile as much cotton as they could before war broke out and the price of cotton skyrocketed. Some of these mills began making clothing for Union Army soldiers. After the Civil War, the steam engine took off as a better source of power within these mills, and manufacturers in Dawson were quick to adopt this. However, other mill cities that sat on ports thrived far better, as hydropower was no longer a necessity for manufacturing, and their cargo could be transported easier and cheaper, as maritime freight was still more efficient than freight rail. This led inland mill cities like Dawson, Lowell, and Lewiston to be economically threatened by port cities like Fall River, Mass., Portland, Maine, and New London, Connecticut. But that didn't stop the continued growth of mill cities. And in fact, we'll see just how big these inland mill cities will get. Thanks for watching or listening to the 5th episode of Dawson. If you liked this, please consider subscribing so you can be the first to know when episode 5 drops, and leave a like to show your positive reinforcement. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the handle unnamedwithmatt. And if you would like to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at unnamednarrative@gmail.com.